Thank you. I would like to give floor to Dr. Zin from the Institute of Karpenko, Physical Mechanical Institute of Karpenko. We're going to be presenting work by a team of authors, inhibitory pigments for nanoporous zeolite, paints and pigments, which was part of the state program, Nanomaterials. So basically, this is a part of the results, which is the closest part to commercialization. A few words about the prerequisites and the conditions for this work. As we know, inhibiting pigments are added to the base of the coatings and paints in order to protect their properties. And they are widely used in aviation and automobile industry to protect the metallic constructs against the atmosphere effect. And none of the proper paint is used without this pigments. But in Ukraine, these pigments have been constituting a problem. They are basically not produced. A lot of them are imported from China, for instance. And in such primer coatings, the chroma materials are used. And even the US regulation, there's a document that regulates the coating of military aircraft. And cerium inhibitors are to be used with chroma inhibitors. So we need to develop the new inhibiting pigments and possibly to replace the more toxic. So we're talking about more environmentally safe inhibitors, inhibitory pigments. And we had an idea to use zeolites, nanoporous zeolites, as a basis for this primer coating. They can be synthetic or they can be natural. In Ukraine, there are deposits, the big many-ton deposits where there are natural zeolites. Zeolites themselves are a crystalline aluminosilicate anion, which is nanoporous, and the positive charge is compensated by cations. It has a tetrahedral structure, and it's not soluble. It is retained in the coating, unlike other pigments who are soluble, who change the volume. And they create those microporous defects through which the corrosion gets to the coating. So this has a nanoporous structure and very well developed surface. It has a very positive factor. It has a much more developed surface, and it enables it to take more cations during the cation-ion exchange. So based on this, we had done some scientific research about the possibility to modify the zeolite by the various ions and to study the anti-corrosion properties. As a result, we have obtained these new pigments modified by zinc ion, calcium, and manganese. There are 3 options, although we can expand the list. And they have indeed an anti-corrosive effect. Adding these pigments to primer coating decreases the corrosion of metal under the coating. If there is some corrosion under this coating, the pigments lets the corrosion in. As soon as it starts, the pigment gets into work. Otherwise, it just sits in the coating. As soon as there is a corrosion element, for instance, hydrogen, this hydrogen removes calcium ions from the zeolite, and they close the gap, and they inhibit the corrosion significantly. So this is the method of action of this pigment. Internationally, this is a well-known pigment. It's called calcium ion exchange silica. It's an amorphous silica oxide which contains ion exchange cation, calcium cation. But it's not nanoporous, and our comparative studies show that it has worse inhibiting properties. Probably because this zeolite has more cation exchange capacity and can be more effective. As for the market, the possible market for this pigment, if we succeed, so the market for this pigment is production of components for coatings and paints and primer coatings. In Ukraine, it is assessed at about 5,000 tons per year. This is just an assessment. If we take the total amount of paints produced in Ukraine, 1,000 tons, of them 1/3 is anti-corrosion paints, and 20% of the total paint is pigment. So we can come up with some figures, sales estimates. But Ukraine doesn't produce any, except some small firms. As I said, there are large ton imports from China, and the cost of this pigment is 16 to 32 hryvnias per kilo. The raw material is rather cheap. The zeolite is rather cheap. Now, the technology of obtaining these nanostructured anti-corrosion element is intercalation of natural zeolite by cations that can inhibit underfilled corrosion of metal. This intercalation can occur in liquid and solid phase. We have tried both. Intercalated inhibiting pigment starts to act as soon as corrosion occurs under the paint defect. The reaction is due to ion exchange with corrosive environment and the creation of passive film on the metal surface. Besides, our studies show that at certain conditions it can effectively interact with other inhibitors, for instance zinc phosphate, and this action will be even stronger if the pigment is used separately, so we can talk about synergy effect. As for intellectual property, of course we work in this field. We obtain patents in Ukraine, although not everything has been patented yet, and some of the some singular know-how we'd like to retain in order to obtain a more serious patent abroad. Now, another thing about peculiarities of this pigment. And it can be an alternative to toxic chromates. They are toxic when you coat, when you do the coating, and there is a EU normative to prohibit them in the near future. And these new pigments allow to obtain the highly efficient pigments by using affordable local mineral resources to decrease the imports of anti-corrosional elements. Using these pigments will help Ukrainian producers to create anti-corrosion coatings and paints that are competitive on the global market. Economic advantages. The new pigments will have lower cost compared to imported ones. The necessary amount of anti-corrosion pigment is not produced in Ukraine. Because we need at least half of it to be replaced. What we hope for? We can suggest this intercalation technology of natural zeolite with two valent cations in order to implement it in practically. We need to procure a set of equipment for a pilot synthesis. It's not expensive, and we can modernize the old equipment, and the necessary amount is several dozen thousand hryvnias. So it's quite moderate. And of course, the practical implementation allows us to produce commercial batches of pigment. Our next steps. We will try to organize larger scale production, engaging the small and medium enterprises. We have contacts with some of them. We will be presenting the new inhibiting pigments on conferences. We will publish articles. We will place ads on the internet sites, promo. Now, the market impact, as I said, availability of a new type of inhibiting pigments will enable us to produce the effective and competitive anti-corrosive and paint materials for the global market. And these pigments can substitute a more expensive analogies. And a new segment of inhibiting pigments for organic coatings. Because as I said, the existing pigments are largely quite toxic. So here are some of my contacts, and please feel free to contact. Thank you, Mr. Zin. Are there any questions? When you said the price of 1 kilogram, 16 to 32 hryvnias, I think this is fantastic. No, it's not the price of zeolite. It's the price of a set. Okay, what is the comparable price in the West? I think this is in the West the same price range for inhibiting pigments. For instance, zinc phosphate is about the same 32 hryvnias per kilo. Yeah, I did my homework. I know the figures. Zeolite can be even cheaper than 16. It's cheap, but the technology needs some investment. This makes it a little more expensive. Therefore, we assess the average, but we're not economists. But basically, it's cheap. One of the most widely spread inhibiting pigments is the paints, zinc-based paints. Could you compare the zinc-based paints with your pigment? Zinc and the paints with this pigment or phosphate or chroma, they're different classes. They exist at the same time, and each one has a certain niche. So each one has a certain pros and cons. They're not comparable. Zinc, for instance, what is zinc-filled paint? There's 95% of zinc and only 5% of organic paint. So it's a metallic composite. That's why it's very expensive. These paints, on the other hand, were 30% of pigments and 70% of the paint itself. That's a different proportion. So, the zinc-filled paint should be more compared to the zinc coating, not with paint coating. Okay, we'll now break for coffee. We have a question from Professor Libovka. Вимкніть інші мікрофони.
He asked about the main characteristics of the liquid crystal materials.
Був запитання про основні характеристики матеріалів.
Of using of this material in the industry. I want to say that the effect is not certain for these materials because when we add nanotubes inside the material, we can increase, for example, rising time. It's approximately about 10 microseconds adding by nanotube, but we increase the switching time, but we can remove the typical oscillation in the liquid crystalline display devices that is present without nanotubes. That's why it's necessary to select the proper technology in order to improve the certain characteristic. Example, in some display and technology, we need to decrease the rising time. That's why we can add a nanotube. But when we increase the switching time, we can adapt the proper material without big aggregate. We can expect that switching time should be not very high. That's why I think that this technology requires the adaptation to the industry.
Thank you very much. And now we have a coffee break announced.